Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In the previous section, we created this what if model. And this model shows monthly payments for various values of two variables. One variable is the interest rate and the other variable is the number, in this case, the number of periods over which we're paying off a loan. Now, one thing we didn't vary as part of this model is the amount of the loan. And of course, there are other variables when we're working out these payments, such as future value and the type. So even with this relatively straightforward payment example, we could have about 5 variables involved. Now, once you get beyond 2 variables, then a flat 2-dimensional worksheet is not going to work in quite the same way. So the question is, how do we deal with having more than 2 variables? Now, one way of doing this is to use what is called the Scenario Manager. And using the Excel Scenario Manager, we can in effect deal with a much larger number of variables. In fact, you can have up to 32 variables with Scenario Manager. We aren't going to go through anything quite as complex as that, but we are going to extend this model a little bit. And the first step to doing this is I'm going to give various entities involved in this model names, as it's much easier to keep track of what's going on with this model if you refer to names rather than cells. So let's do that first. Let's start with the amount of the loan. Now, you have a choice here in terms of names, and different people like to do this in different ways. One option is to use the simple default name. So if I click Define Name in the Defined Names group, I could use this as the name Loan Amount, and Excel is picking that up from the cell to the left of where we're currently clicked. Alternatively, you could use an informative word like principal, as in the principal of a loan, or you could use the term as it's referred to in the PMT formula. So for example, you could use PV here if you wanted to. What I'm going to do on this occasion is go for that middle option, and I'm going to put principal. Now, the next 2 variables are interest rate and number of periods, and we have both of those in use in our what if table. But let's give them both a name. So I'm going to use the exact same process. And on this occasion, I'm happy to stick with those default names. I've got 2 other potential variables as well. One of them is the future value, and I'm going to leave that for now because once you've added 1 variable to the list, you can add as many as you like, up to 32. But what I'm going to do though is put the type of payment in row 3. Now, having done that, I'm going to give it a name, and I'm happy to stick with the default of type. Now, if we go down to our formula in cell C6 and just look at that in the formula bar, what I'm going to do is start to replace some of these cell references with those named ranges that we've just created. So let's start with the one that we've just done and replace this one with type. And then, of course, instead of C2, we can replace that in the formula with principal. Just for completeness, I'm going to add C4 and C5 as well. So C4 is the interest rate. And C5 is the number of periods. So now somebody looking at that formula in cell C6 will probably find it a lot easier to understand using those names. Now, the Scenario Manager we access from the Data tab. In the Forecast group, what if analysis, and scenario manager. And it probably won't surprise you to know that the scenario manager manages scenarios, and we currently don't have any scenarios defined. So we can click add to add our first scenario. Now I'm going to give the scenario a name in a moment, but the first thing we need to do is to decide which cells are going to change in this scenario. Now the basis of our calculation is cells from C2 to C5, the ones that we've just given names to. Two of them vary on the worksheet and the other two don't. So it's the loan amount and the type that would vary. And you need to specify in the changing cells box there which are the changing cells. If they're non-adjacent, you can select them just by holding down Control as you click. So in changing cells, let's delete out what we have. And we're going to select loan amount, Control key, and type. So the two cells that are changing in here are the principal and the payment type. So I'm going to stick with the values that are in those at the moment. That's why I'm going to say for a name, principal $5,000, payments at the beginning of the period. And the reason why I've given it that name is because the type we're using in this scenario is 1, which again indicates payments at the beginning of the period. Now there are two checkboxes at the bottom of the dialog. One says prevent changes and one says hide. If the worksheet is protected, then these will take effect. One of them prevents somebody else who cannot unprotect the sheet from changing the scenario, and the other one hides the scenario altogether, so they can be useful when other people are accessing this workbook or worksheet. So that's our first scenario. Let's click on OK. And this little dialog comes up with the scenario values. And Excel has done a pretty good job at working out what those are in this case. So I'm going to click OK. And you can see now in Scenario Manager that I have my first scenario listed. Now let's suppose I want to have another scenario, and this one I'm going to specify payments at the end of the payment period. So I click on Add again and give it a name. Principal $5,000, payments at end of period. Now the two values that we're varying are the principal and the payment type again, and the payment type of 1 indicates a payment at the beginning of a payment period. So we have the same changing cells as before, and let's click on OK. And of course it brings up the same dialog, and on this occasion for payment at the end of the period, the type will be 0, and click on OK. So now I have two scenarios listed in my Scenario Manager, one for payments at the beginning of the period and one for payments at the end of the period. Now if I select a particular scenario, let's say the second one, and click on Show, you'll see I now have the values for payments at the end of the period. If I click on the top one and click Show, it shows me the values for payments at the beginning of the period. So you can very easily toggle between your different scenarios that you've created to see those different values and those different scenarios and situations. Now let's look at one or two other options in this Scenario Manager dialog. We have the Edit option, and obviously that lets you edit the selected scenario. And there's also a Merge option. This can be particularly useful in situations where you've distributed a workbook to a number of different people and you've asked them to create their own scenarios. So you may want to merge those back into one workbook, and you can use this merge facility to merge scenarios from different workbooks and different worksheets, put them all together to perhaps look at a full set of scenario options. The final option is a very useful one, because one of the things you may have realized is that although we only have two scenarios there, you can't actually look at both of them at the same time, which makes it hard to do a comparison. But if you click on Summary, you get two options there. One of them is the produce a scenario summary, or you can create a scenario pivot table report, and I'll leave you to experiment with the pivot table report. In the summary, you can select one or more cells to show. So let's suppose, for example, that we were looking for the least expensive option for a 10-year loan, so 120 months, at 5%. So this particular cell here, H14, is the one that I'm interested in. That's the one I want to show. So let's click on OK. And we get a scenario summary report. Now note our two scenarios are along the top here. Principal $5,000 payment at the beginning, principal $5,000 payment at the end. And you can see the values of the variables for the scenarios, principal, and type. And then you can see the value in the selected cell. So in this case, with the payment at the beginning, it's $52.81 a month. And with a payment at the end, it's $53.03. So if in this case I want to find the cheapest option, that's a good way of comparing the cost. Now that's it on Scenario Manager. In the next section, we're going to take a look at Goal Seek, so please join me for that.